Carey Institute's public lecture series. My name is Laura Quillen, and I'm the Carey Institute's Director of Communications. For the new faces in the crowd tonight, the Carey Institute is a not-for-profit, independent environmental research organization. Our staff is actively investigating some of society's most pressing environmental issues, from the health of fresh water to invasive species. Our public lecture series seeks to connect you with inspirational and educational programming. And I just wanted to mention we have another program coming up very quickly in 2 weeks. Our writer, author in residence, writer artist in residence, she wears many hats, Lynn Cherry is going to be presenting a lecture on December 2nd, and she's going to talk about her life's work engaging youth through books and video. She's written over 30 different books about the environment, mostly for young adults and children, and she illustrates these books. She does beautiful work, and I encourage you all to attend and learn about her journey doing that and reaching out to students. Her lecture is mostly going to focus on connecting kids with science and her journey doing that. I think it will be appropriate for kids, but it's not specifically structured for children. We had talked about that a little, having her just read stories and how that'd be fun for kids. But the event's going to be more looking at her journey connecting this type of science to students, not mostly, but to get them to think they can be part of the action and part of the solution of environment in the future. She'll also be showing some videos that capture that. It should be a really inspirational event. So I'd say yes, bring kid-friendly, but not made for kids. So, sure. And tonight we're going to be hearing from Mike Clarke, Executive Director of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. He's going to discuss how climate change, shrinking habitat, and politics are shaping the future of some of Yellowstone's most iconic wildlife, including grizzlies, wolves, and bison. He's had a distinguished leadership career working with environmental organizations, including the Environmental Policy Institute, Friends of the Earth, and Yellowstone Heritage, a ranchlands preservation group. He also directed the Western Water Project of Trout Unlimited, a 5-state effort to change water laws in the West. This is his second time at the helm of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. They're an organization dedicated to protecting the integrity of the land, water, and wildlife of Greater Yellowstone. And during his tenure in the 90s, he helped prevent a gold mine from opening near the northeast corner of the park. So without any further ado, I would like to turn it over to Mike. He's going to transport us to the wonders of Yellowstone and all that's confronting this wonderful ecosystem. Let's bring up this couch. We're going to trade.
How does that sound? Technology. I'm almost a Luddite, so I'm hoping that this slide system will work for all of us tonight. Thank you all for coming. The Greater Yellowstone Coalition was created 28 years ago by a group of scientists and citizens who were concerned about the protection of our greatest best-known national park, Yellowstone, which was the world's first national park. And Greater Yellowstone is the region around it. The Yellowstone Park takes up about 2.2 million acres of land. Greater Yellowstone, the region around it where I work, is about 20 million acres of land that we try to make sure is protected for future generations. 80% of that land is federal land, mostly Forest Service, our national park, and the 20% that's private is composed largely of large ranches in the river valleys. This is the most intact ecosystem in the lower 48 states. The most intact large ecosystem in the lower 48 states. Let's see if I can manage this. The map doesn't show it very well, but you can see in the gold Yellowstone Park in the middle, and around it are the great national forests. There's 7 national forests, and some of the darker green areas are wilderness areas. Much of this land is protected either by being in a national park or in wilderness, which are our 2 most strongest forms of protection in this country. The lower right, you can see the Wind River Reservation. We have several reservations near us. This is one of the largest areas where there are very few roads in our country. If you look at the Yellowstone region, which is everything you see on this map, the numbers of people living in it are less than 9 people per square mile, which is how the U.S. Bureau of Census defines frontier. So right in the middle of the West, you have this huge expanse in which most people do not live there anywhere because it is federal land, and except for the people who watch over that land, there's almost no one living in it. At the same time, we have perhaps 3 to 4 million people a year who come from all over the world to see the wonders of Yellowstone. Most of them, when they come, say their first priority is wildlife. They want to see the wildlife, and then they want to see the geysers. And most people who come want to see wolves and grizzlies. So I'll be talking about that some tonight, those 2 species and the challenges that we face. Also about bison and about elk. We have the largest concentration of big mammals living in this region of any place in the lower 48. And our intent at the Greater Yellowstone Coalition is to keep them pretty much like they are, so that 50 years from now, your descendants can come out and experience the wonders of Yellowstone pretty much as we do now. We know there'll be some changes, but our goal is not to stop time, because we know full well that's not the doable thing, but to make sure that these lands are protected so the plants and animals that are there now can be there. And of course, if you watch TV, you also know that we have the largest volcano on dry land, and if you listen to the movie industry, it's going to blow any moment. It goes up about every 2.5 million years, and we're 50,000 years overdue, but it's not something we can do anything about, so we don't worry about it. This map is, I think, one of the more remarkable examples of why we are different. Over in here is the Bighorn Mountains in Sheridan, Wyoming. This is the Wyoming-Montana border, Idaho border here, Jackson here, and central Idaho over in here. This big blank area here, this big white area, is Greater Yellowstone, and it is largely roadless. This map shows all the major roads that are maintained by government, county level up, in our region. So you can see that this is an enormous blank area. And that's because of the national park, which is located here. And then around it are these big wilderness areas. The Wind Rivers, the Sorka Beartooth Plateau wilderness area. And so much of my work revolves, and this gold line that runs around it here is the rough boundary of the Greater Yellowstone region. We are trying to keep this pretty much so it will look like that 100 years from now. This big, intense mass of land here is the Snake River Plain. Those are farm roads. That's the biggest potato growing region in the world. And so each of these roads around here reflect either mining or logging or ranching historically. And so here's Jackson. If you've been to Jackson, the Tetons are in here. Yellowstone Lake over here. This region also is the headwaters of the 3 great rivers of the West. The Colorado starts in here. The Snake curls around down in here and goes out through the Columbia. And the Missouri starts about right here and flows north, and then east. It's the longest free-flowing river in the lower 48 states. Flows 700 miles to the North Dakota border, and it is not dammed along that length. So we've got the 3 great rivers of the West, and increasingly as we look at this region, as we study it more and more, one of the things that we are confronting is the reality that climate is changing. And I'll be talking some about that tonight. But our big challenges over the last 30 years have revolved around the wildlife species that are so well known. Grizzlies, wolves, elk, bison. But increasingly, what we're doing at GYC and the federal agencies are doing is rethinking our plans and priorities based on the fact that we know that the climate is getting warmer. This part of the world is probably going to get drier. As it does, there are going to be more and more fires and more changes. If you look at the 3 states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, these big rivers coming out, 95 to 98% of that water that's used by people is used for agriculture, to grow grass for cattle. That's going to change if the droughts that we were predicting take place. This is the Lamar Valley in the middle of Yellowstone Park. Quite a lovely spot, full of bison. This particular area you're looking at is generally closed off through most of the year because there's so many grizzlies that inhabit this area. What you will see from the road, and there's a road that goes right through where this photograph is taken from the road. And in the summer, you will see large herds of bison and elk, but what you don't see is the presence of the grizz. And the grizz, more than anything else in our region, defines what's so special about Yellowstone. If you did not have the grizz, I think you would not have the spirit and the wildness of Yellowstone that is so special. This map, which is a map of the Greater Yellowstone, shows the territory of the grizzly. In the 1960s, it was predicted there were only about 200 grizzlies left in our region. And if you ask most scientists what they thought about the future, the scientists who were studying the grizzly would say to you that it will be extinct within 100 years because the numbers were going down. Less than 200. An isolated population, the largest population in the lower 48 states, but one that was not really thought to be sustainable, that would be around for a long period of time. And so the federal government set up special programs to try to preserve and protect the grizz. And they set up a grizzly recovery area. It's shown by, I'll come back to that. This purple blue line is the recovery zone of the grizz. It was established by the federal government, and within that line, we try to have special protections for the grizzly. So the gold is the Yellowstone Park, and you can see the dark green are the wilderness areas, lots of wilderness there. And that's also the area that shows up blank on that road map. This gold line is quite remarkable. It's 2 years old, so it's out of date. This is where grizzlies are showing up now. We have over 600 grizzlies now in the region. The population has tripled since 1960. And it has done so because people have changed their behavior toward the grizzly, people who live in our region. Grizzly management is not about grizzlies, it's about people management. And people have learned to tolerate the grizzly. They've learned how to protect their food sources and their garbage. And as a result, we are seeing a slowly increasing level of bears in our region. Even so, if you look at an average year, there are only about 50 grizzly sows in a given year that produce cubs. Now, the region is so rich in food that you often have 2 cubs, and sometimes you have 3. But even so, every grizzly sow is a major resource. It takes an average grizzly sow 10 years to produce offspring that will replace her, because the cubs typically do not live to maturity. So it's very difficult. A grizzly will not start bearing cubs until she's 5 or 6 years old. She will have a litter maybe every 3 years, and she protects those litter for a couple of years, and then we'll start another one. But it's a very slow and very delicate process. And here is a good example. This is a wonderful mother. This was taken by a friend of mine in the Lamar Valley, where she was feeding on a bison that had been winter killed with these young cubs. These are cubs of the year. These are probably 3 months old. Quite a remarkable animal and totally tolerant of people. On an average day while she was on that river, there would be hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe a half a mile away, watching her and photographing her, and she became a very popular image. As you can see, she is a gorgeous, gorgeous creature. Hard to tell her height. I'm 6'6", and she would tower about 2 feet above me. A male would tower another foot or two above me. These are enormous animals, and they're wary of people. They're not necessarily dangerous unless you surprise them. They do not like to be around people, and if they know you're there or you're coming, they typically move away. So, for us, the grizzlies are a definition of what is special about Yellowstone.
Try that one.
They play just like we do. This bear is sliding down a snowfield. Can you hear me all right?
Lost the sound.
Let me go see camera.
I'm keeping on this recording works, but I was raised my volume, okay? Can you hear me now? Okay. So these bears have a sense of humor. They like to play, and this one is having a very good time. They're largely solitary creatures. They don't, once they're adults, they don't associate much with adults, but you often see them playing, swimming in the rivers, doing things like this, and it's quite a remarkable situation. During the Bush years, about 8 years ago, the Bush administration decided to try to delist the grizzly and remove it from protections under the Endangered Species Act. We filed suit on that to block it, and we won. And they put the grizzly back on the Endangered Species Act. We had hoped that when Obama came in, this whole thing would be settled. Unfortunately, the Obama administration chose to try to delist again. The case has been appealed to the Federal Appeals Court, and we are waiting now for a decision that should happen between now and Christmas that will determine whether or not the grizz remains on the list. And so we're facing a major battle about the future of the grizzly, just like we have in recent years over wolves, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But the future of the grizzly is now in the hands of the court and in the hands of public opinion. We think that we're going to win this lawsuit because the ruling by the first judge was very clear. And he said there are two things that make it unwise to delist the grizz. The first is that there are not adequate regulations on a county and state level to make sure that people don't go out when the protections are removed and begin to kill bears. The other was that he said the Forest Service had underestimated the impacts of climate change on the region. Our region is now increasingly popular. Population has gained about 75% in the last 15 years. So these animals are surrounded by a sea of people. And Yellowstone is a high island of mountains with their habitat. We are concerned that as human population continues to grow, it puts more pressure on the grizzlies. Climate change is going to remove some of their key food sources, such as whitebark pine. And we are worried now that as that happens, the bears will have no choice but to move down in elevation from the high mountains, and then when they do, there will be more and more conflicts with people. And so we're very concerned about what's going to happen. We've had actually a very unusual thing. For 25 years, we never had a human fatality in Yellowstone caused by a grizzly. We've now had 3 in the last 2 years. Each one very different from the other. We don't think there's a pattern yet, but there's more and more concern that as the population of bears increases and the conflicts with people increase, we will see a change in the attitude of folks in our region. So we're very concerned and watching this very closely. Neat photograph of this big bear. They're really quite amazing creatures. Very graceful. They can outrun a dog at a short distance. And they can certainly outrun all of us. And one of the things that we are now suggesting that everybody should do if they come to Yellowstone and hike is that you carry bear spray or pepper spray, which is a propellant that will that will drive them away. Bears, when you surprise them, especially sows, will typically charge a human being. These are bluff charges. They will make a lot of racket and charge straight at you. When they get about 15 or 20 yards away, they will bow up and raise up on their legs and look at you, and typically they turn away. The 10% of the time they don't, if you carry bear spray, the figures show that it will work 90% of the time. So, the odds are pretty good if you're careful, you make a lot of noise, and you carry bear spray, you're only at risk 2% of the time. And if you are in that 2%, what you don't want to do is yell or run, because that provokes a chase reaction in the bear, and it's usually not a pleasant encounter. I'll come back to grizzlies in a few minutes. This is an amazing set of maps. On the top is a map of the interior West. So Utah down here, Idaho, here's Yellowstone here in the middle. These, in a time of climate change, there are three major places in the West that we think can be long-term refugia for plants and animals that are wild. Yellowstone, which is this big green gold area here. Central Idaho, and that dark green is wilderness. It's one of the most remote, roadless areas in the country. And Glacier National Park, and what we call the crown of the continent, the big wild lands of Bob Marshall Wilderness, the Glacier Park extending, and that land extends north into the Canadian wilderness. These three areas, for a whole bunch of reasons, are, we think, the best refugia in the West, the best places in a time of climate change to make sure that the plants and animals that we care about will have a home in the future. This map down here is a 2-year-old map showing wolf packs. 16 years ago, we brought 31 wolves in from Canada, from up in here, and put 31 in Yellowstone and about 34, 35 in central Idaho. This map shows what's happened in the last 15 years. Each one of these dots is a wolf pack. Now, they're not all alive now. Some were destroyed because they predated on cattle or sheep. But you can see how, in 15 years, wolves have moved across the landscape all through this area and are doing a remarkable job of recovering. Wolves were exterminated from our region in the 1930s. In 15 years, we brought them back. There are now about 1,500 wolves scattered across the 3 states, with about 500 in the area around Yellowstone Park, the rest in central Idaho and western Montana. We thought, and we still think, that this is one of the most successful wildlife reintroduction programs in American history. There are few examples in such a short time where a species has recovered. As their numbers increased, their impacts also increased. In the beginning, the ranching community was often against them, but they have begun to accommodate to having wolves around. They do kill livestock, but the numbers of kills are much less than we anticipated. And for example, in Wyoming, which is on the lower place here, eagles kill more livestock in Wyoming than wolves. They attack young sheep, young calves. Wild dogs, running free from their masters, kill more livestock in Wyoming than wolves. But as the wolf numbers increased, one of the things that happened that we did not anticipate was that the elk hunting community would begin to believe that the wolves were driving down the numbers of elk. We have across these 3 states the largest concentration of elk other than Colorado in the West. Thousands of hunters every year from our region and from around the country come to hunt the elk, and it's a major resource, revenue resource for landowners and for outfitters. When wolves move into a region, the elk, in the absence of wolves, tend to congregate in large herds. And that's true in Yellowstone Park, it's true in the other big river valleys. When the wolves show up, the elk herds break up, into smaller units, and they began to move around. And it's not unusual for in one valley that you might have had 1,000 elk the year before. If the wolves show up, the elk moves in the next valley. Well, if you're an outfitter or a hunter and you've spent a lot of years trying to figure out how to hunt in a particular area and harvest an elk, and you go into that area and then, well, it's not unusual to believe that the wolves have destroyed what you had hoped to do. And so over the last 3 years, a major political shift occurred in our region. We had thought there was widespread public support for having wolves, and many of us took great pride in having these animals, even though they do cause some problems. The elk hunters became convinced that the wolves were driving down the numbers. And so they began to criticize it, and they began to build pressure on our congressional delegations to do something about it. And so over the last 18 months, a major change occurred. The Bush administration decided to delist wolves as they had with grizzlies. We went to court with 11 other environmental groups to defend the wolves and to say they should not be taken off the endangered species list for protection. We won in court a series of lawsuits which inflamed the hunting community, and we lost their support. And they went to Congress and convinced congressional leaders that wolves should be taken off the list. And last year, much to our chagrin, Congress passed a law removing wolves from the Endangered Species Act protections. They're now being hunted in Montana and Idaho. It's likely that next year they will be hunted in Wyoming. Of the 1,500 wolves that are in the region now, we think we could lose up to 300 to 400 per year. That's the bad news. The good news is the wolves reproduce so quickly that they actually keep ahead of the curve. In the 1 year before we filed our last lawsuit, in which there was hunting in Idaho and in Montana, while they took several hundred wolves out of the population actually increased slightly. We're hoping that will continue because it is very clear now that Congress has said to all of us, it's time for the states to manage the wolves. And the way they manage them primarily is through hunting. And so there's this amazing spectacle that's working out across our region now. And QYC and other groups where we no longer have the ability to intervene in the courts successfully, but we're monitoring what's happening, and we will continue to do that. In effect, the Fish and Wildlife Service has said to the states, we will give you a 5-year period to show whether or not you can manage wolves effectively. If you can show you can do that without driving the numbers below a sustainable level, you can keep doing it. And our lawyers now tell us that that's the law of the land, that's the way it's going to be. There are still some lawsuits in process trying to stop the hunting. Our assessment is that those will not win in court. And so we are shifting our efforts at GYC, we're shifting our efforts to do more education in our region with the public, both in our region and nationally, to say to people, hey, we got choices, we have to see what happens, but this is a major issue. This is a remarkable map. It's one of the most remarkable maps, I think, in American history. Because in 15 years, these animals came back at a blistering rate. And we think that there are enough of them now that even if you lose as much as a third of the population, they're here to stay. They are not going to go away. And I think if it's proven that the states cannot manage responsibly, I'm convinced the American public will basically rise up and say, hey, if you can't do it right, management should go back into the hands of the feds. But this is one of the great philosophical debates that we are having now in our country. And it is happening in large part because Yellowstone is so unique. It is surrounded by a sea of people. There's no other place in the world where this kind of debate can go on, because we as a people are deciding whether or not we can live sustainably with grizzlies and with wolves, the two big predators in our system. Nowhere else in the world can you have that kind of debate. We have the same frictions in Alaska and in parts of Canada. But here in the lower 48, it's an amazing battle. We're going to need your help if you care about these two animals, these two species. Over the years, this is going to go on. It should not be a debate that is formed primarily by the people of my region. This is a national debate, and we need help from folks like you to make sure that it stays that way. So, this is an adult wolf. They're quite amazing species to watch, and they're both wary of people and they're curious. If you come to Yellowstone in the winter, which is one of the great experiences I think for anybody who's done it, it is possible to get fairly near these animals and to watch them hunt and to watch them roam across a very magnificent landscape. And they move quickly. These are amazing predators and amazing creatures of both of great beauty and of course of fear, because for most humans we know about wolves through Little Red Riding Hood or through the spectacle of those kinds of stories. In effect, they do not harm people. There's only one or two cases we know of in recorded history on this continent of wolves attacking humans. A year after the wolf packs were brought into Yellowstone, they initially were put into 3 or 4 acre pens and acclimated to the climate and the situation, and then they were turned loose. A year after they were brought in, I went with the scientists who were managing them into a 3 acre pen with my 10-year-old daughter, and there were 5 adults and 7 pups in that pen, and we were sent in there to capture them because we wanted to move them to a different part of Yellowstone Park and turn them loose. And the chief scientist who was doing the work said to me, "You don't have to worry about the wolves, they won't bother you. You don't have to worry about your daughter, she will be fine." They handed her a net, a big fish net that was about 3 feet across, and said, "You help capture the pups." And they handed me a camera and said, "You photograph what goes on." And we went into the pen, and they had dart guns because they wanted to dart the adults and sedate them so they could move them a different area. The pups were captured by hand, and they started running around the perimeter of this pen on the inside, and they ran within a couple of feet of me several times as they were moving around. There was never a bark or a growl or a snarl. When you touch the pups with the net, they would actually roll over on their backs and stay still. And the adults we eventually guarded and sedated them down and put them in cages and moved them. My daughter was able to help capture a couple of the pups. It was, I think, one of the more amazing experiences of her young life, and certainly of mine. But it demonstrated the dominant theory. If a wolf feels like the animal next to it is dominant, they do not attack. They only attack in general when they're looking for food, and they do that very well. They are also an animal that generates an enormously strong reaction in people, like that sigh there. You either love them or you hate them. They create a visceral reaction, and I think one of the more fascinating things that's happening right now in our region, that I wish a good writer who understands psychology could come and begin to do interviews and talking to people. There is this reaction amongst people in our region and people here that is very strong. I think some people are literally born with a visceral fear of wolves. Just like some people do have that reaction to snakes. And yet the rest of us identify with these animals in some fashion. These are not dogs, but they're quite magnificent. And I'll come back and talk about them later. This map is perhaps one of the most amazing maps, I think, in American history. It shows the range of the American bison. In 1870, it's estimated that across this region there were 30 million bison. This map was made in 1889 by the chief naturalist of his day. The green is a shaded area that our staff added, and the 2 yellow spots and an orange spot. So you can see that in historic times, the bison ranged across most of this continent. By 1889, there were less than 100 animals left in the United States. There were less than 100 in Texas, 2 herds maintained by cattle ranchers who were trying to breed the animals with cattle, and 25 animals in Yellowstone, and 15 in the Bronx Zoo. So we were down to about 100 animals in the United States. And Yellowstone Park became the chief protectorate, the chief place for them, and these herds were moved to Yellowstone, where they were protected ultimately by the Army, poaching the herd, but the herds were protected. If you look across the country today, we now have about 250,000 bison that are mostly raised for meat. But the Yellowstone herd is still there. There's about 4,000 animals. They are the only genetically pure herd of bison left that we have, because all the other bison have been mixed in some small fashion with cattle genes. We would not know it looking at them what the scientists do. The 4,000 numbers in Yellowstone Park, you can see they have been confined now to an area of about 2 million acres compared to the hundreds of millions of acres they used to roam. So we as a people have pulled them back to a very small area. Even more tragically, I think, because some of these bison have a disease called brucellosis, which can cause cattle to abort their young. When the bison in Yellowstone have come out of the park in the last 25 years, they've all been killed by the various states, because the agricultural industry, the cattle industry, is afraid that the bison will pass on this disease to their cattle. So they've been shot, hundreds and thousands of them, as they migrate out in the winter in search of food. So the only safe haven they have is Yellowstone Park. Now last year, for the first time in 60 years, we had a live herd come out of Yellowstone that was not killed. It was a herd that had been cleaned of any sign of brucellosis. And they were 84 bison were taken to Ted Turner's ranch near where I live in Bozeman and protected there. In 5 years, that herd, Ted will keep 3/4 of the calves. The rest of the animals will go to the state of Montana, which has been routinely slaughtering the bison every year. We think this is a major victory because the attitudes of the federal government and the state governments are shifting and providing more tolerance for bison. So those 84 animals are the first group, we hope, that will establish a path of safety, so as the animals naturally reproduce in Yellowstone Park, and they gain about 10% a year ordinarily in a good year, when they come out, they're slaughtered. We now think there is a way to take these animals safely when they come out of the park and put them on U.S. Fish and Wildlife refuges and other places in the West. And there are now over 40 Indian tribes that are asking for the bison. So our hope is that these Yellowstone bison can be moved to those safe places and begin to reproduce and bring new herds into existence. It's a moment of hope. It's been quite unusual because for 20 years we've been battling. You can see a Yellowstone Park here on the bottom border here. The only 2 places they could come out is around West Yellowstone and around Gardner. We've just gotten a victory. We just leased private land up here, we meaning the conservation community, and by leasing that land, it opens up a path for the animals to go into 75,000 acres of national forest land right in here. We think the bison should be allowed access to national forest land. And if they do, then the Yellowstone herd will be able to spread across Greater Yellowstone in the national forest and live like the elk do or the deer. They're not the same. Bison are big, like Sherman tanks. They go wherever they want to go, and they're largely indifferent to people. So if they start going somewhere, you're not going to stop them very easily, and they will walk through a fence without even acknowledging that it's there. So they're not the same as most wildlife, but we think they can be tolerated, and we think they can be managed. And so we're right at the cusp of a major shift in bison management policy and Yellowstone. I think in the next 10 years, we're going to be able to, in effect, free the bison from the prisons of Yellowstone so they can move into the national forest that exists, as you can see here, all around Yellowstone. Not all the habitat is suitable, and they're not going to be allowed to remain on public land or on private land. That's probably too dangerous for the livestock industry. But we're really seeing a significant shift here, and it's quite remarkable. And I have to say to you bluntly, for the first time in 10 years, I am hopeful that we will be able to, in effect, liberate the bison very soon. And it will have, I think, a big impact across the West. Young cats, if you want to see this, come to Yellowstone in May or June. The bison give birth during those months, and they hang around the roads. Later in the summer, they move up into the mountains out of sight. But you can see these little creatures, and they're red. They're very lively, and they have a lot of fun. Yellowstone in winter is one of the more amazing spectacles in our nation. This is a bison with snow. The reason they have, the reason they have beards is because they use the beards to sweep the snow off to get to the grass. I happen to like animals with beards, and these are my favorite animals in the park, actually. We've also had a major battle over the last 20 years around snowmobiles. You may have heard something about that. GYC takes the position that snowmobiles are not a proper instrument to be used in a national park because they're loud and they're dirty, and there are easier ways to take people into the park. We're in favor of taking people in. We just think if you're going to take people into the park in the winter, you ought to do it with the most efficient method possible, which we think are vans with treads, so you can move over the snow safely and easily. So we went into court and began what's been almost a 15-year battle to get them out. We're making some progress. I'll give you two quick examples. 10 years ago, 70,000 snowmobiles a year were going into Yellowstone in the winter. They were two-cylinder engines. They were loud. They were dirty. About a third of the fuel came out the exhaust pipe because the engines were not very efficient. And the owners of these machines were often harassing the wildlife because in the winter, the bison and the elk use the roads just like people. And there were major conflicts. Last year, 10 years ago, 70,000 vehicles. Last year, 14,000. All were four-cylinder, relatively clean, quiet, and every group that went in had to be guided by a professional guide whose license depended on the behavior of his clients. If they misbehaved, he would lose his license. Fundamental change in how the park is being used. 10 years ago, most of the people coming into the park on snowmobiles, and I hate to generalize, but there were people looking for a party. A lot of alcohol, a lot of rowdy behavior. Today, the people who come into the park are primarily families with kids who are looking for a wildlife experience. It has been a fundamental change in the way in which people relate to the park in the winter. And I think we're making progress. These animals, that's the Roosevelt Arch. These animals were migrating out looking for food. And because of the policies, the Montana state line is roughly along the arch. Because of the policies of Montana, all the animals you see here were shot as they came out of the park within a couple of days of the time this photograph was taken. We have stopped that now. That is no longer happening. There may be a few more incidents as they work out these new policies, but because of the advocacy of GYC and groups like ours, the slaughter of bison has now, I think, largely ended. If it changes, we'll let you know. But I think we're making some change here. So this is a close-up map of Yellowstone Park, 2.2 million acres. And along the eastern edge, here, the Shoshone National Forest, from the Montana border south about 50 miles, is one of the great untamed places on the national forest. The Shoshone was our first national forest. Yellowstone was carved out of it when it was formed in 1872. This is still a very wild and remote area. There are plans by the oil and gas industry to come in and drill on parts of this national forest. We meaning GYC and other groups, have just launched what we think will be a 10-year campaign to try to get all this land in here declared off limits for oil and gas exploration. It is not a forest that has been industrialized. There are only 2 gas wells on it now. One down in the southern part and one up near the Montana border. We think this is a doable thing, and it will advance protection for these forests in our region in a major way. And you'll be hearing more and more about this. We call this area the Absaroka-Beartooth Front. Absarokas are the volcanics about halfway down the map going south. The Beartooth is a granite uplifting to the north. Beautiful, beautiful area. Everything you hear about the volcano, everything, the volcano right now, is the eastern edge of it is right here on the edge of Yellowstone Park. If it were to blow, everything in this map would be gone. But we don't think that's going to happen. And we think the more important thing is to have long-term protections in case it doesn't blow. So just keep that in mind. Yellowstone cutthroat trout are the native species of the region, and the biggest reservoir they have is Yellowstone Lake, which is the largest high freshwater lake in the west. It's up above 7,000 feet, very cold. And these are beautiful, beautiful trout that have evolved over millions of years and live in Yellowstone Lake. About 25 years ago, some fishermen decided to repopulate the lake with other fish, and they brought in lake trout from a nearby lake and turned them loose in the Yellowstone Lake. We didn't find out about this for several years until some fishermen began to catch lake trout. Well, they're very voracious fish. They feed on cutthroats. An adult lake trout will eat 18 to 20 big cutthroats in a year. And they began to decimate the fish population. The cutthroat population began to decline. The scientists in the park began to determine that something had to be done. They're now running a fish netting operation in Yellowstone Park. The lake is very large and very deep and not well known. But we're beginning to cut back on the number of lake trout. This summer, 250,000 lake trout were caught in these nets and destroyed, and the cutthroat population is beginning to increase. So we think it's turning around. But it's going to be a lifelong struggle. Once a population gets established like that in a lake this size, it probably does not ever go away. We think we can beat them back, but it's going to take a major investment. These are the nets being hauled in. It's sort of like trawling on a small scale. And the fishermen who do this were brought in from the Great Lakes to help. And just this year, we started a new process where this fish is having a small radio transmitter planted inside its body. It transmits to satellites. The data is collected, and you can track where these fish go in the lake. The idea is that these adult fish will go back to the spawning beds where the lake trout breed, and we will be able to track where those spawning beds are and begin to try to destroy them. These are called Judas fish. I won't say any more about that. But this is a major advance, and GYC and other conservation groups are helping raise money so the Park Service can do this. It's a major advance, and we are encouraged by what's happening. But the cutthroat trout, our native trout in the West, are in great peril, both because of this kind of activity with lake trout, but also because their habitat is shrinking, in part because of climate change. Beautiful area. This is the Tetons, Snake River. You can see this guy's having a blast. And this is typical cutthroat water. We have in our region probably the most famous trout streams in America, and I say that carefully because I know I'm in an area where people think differently about that. But I think these are unsurpassed, and we are working hard to make sure that it stays that way. The future of Yellowstone of this region, I think, will, as it always is, be determined by what people do who love the region. And we are facing major challenges. 20 years ago, when I was first running GYC, if someone asked me what the major threat was at that time, I would say to you that it was some form of mining and logging, industrial activity in the national forest, not in the park, that was threatening to destroy the habitat. Over the last 20 years, the amount of mining and logging and ranching in our region has shrunk. Those three categories, mining, logging, and ranching, used to be the mainstay of the Western economy. Today, less than 3% of our population in the region work in a job in mining or logging or ranching. Our economy is now driven by tourism, by retirees, and by the quality of life. If you want to look at where our communities are growing in the West, there are three things that drive growth, human growth in our region: trout, fly fishing, skiing, and airports. Those three factors determine the future of our region. Our population, as I said earlier, has grown by about 70% in the last 15 years. That doesn't sound like a lot for some urban areas. For our region, that's huge. The biggest threat we now face is human population coming in and building up communities and bit by bit destroying the wildness of Yellowstone. There are over 3 million people coming to our region every year to visit. If 1% of those folks decide to come and stay, that's a big impact, and that's roughly what's happening. And so if you care about the future of Yellowstone, you have to focus on what people are doing there and how we choose to live. In a place like this, in the eastern mountains with hardwood forest, where I grew up in the Smokies, the human footprint of an average family at the worst part is probably a circle that's maybe a quarter mile in diameter. And I say that because that's about the range of a high-powered rifle if you're thinking about protecting a homestead. In the west, that footprint is about 5 miles across because the terrain is more open. If you have a pet dog and you let it run loose, studies show that it will range about 5 miles. That's a big difference. So one of the things that we're watching is what's the scale of the human footprint. By that I mean, if you build a house in a wild area, how big an area will that impact? 20% of our land in Greater Yellowstone is private land. Most of it held by large ranchers. I left GYC as the executive director during the Bush years, and in my first 2 or 3 years after I left, I set up a ranchlands group to explore how to save big ranches. And there are 20 counties around Yellowstone Park with private lands. We launched a research effort to look at all agricultural sales of land in Greater Yellowstone from 1990 to 2000. And agricultural sales mean lands of 400 acres or up. Now, 400 acres for this part of the world sounds like a huge amount. Average ranch size in our area is 3,000 acres. So we looked at every sale over 400 acres during a 10-year period. And we discovered that a quarter of all the agricultural land in Greater Yellowstone had changed hands in 10 years. The biggest change in land ownership in 100 years. If you project that rate of change 20 years from 1990 to 2010, and that rate continued, that would mean that half of all the ranch lands in our region would have changed hands and would be held by different owners. And possibly it could be subdivided. Well, that's not happening because of the recession, but the change in ownership is going on. And that's important because in the winter, most of these big mammals come out of the public lands onto the lower elevation private lands. And if those ranch lands are broken up by subdivisions, The migrations cannot continue, and this enormous concentrations of mammals will disappear over time. The public lands and the private lands are entwined. You can't have a Greater Yellowstone without having people cooperating around both. And to give you an example of that, we just learned in the last 5 years that because of climate change, the whitebark pine in our region are all dying. If you've been out west, you know the beetles are moving up in elevation and attacking the firs and the pines across the west, and these huge acreages are turning brown and red and gray and dying. In Greater Yellowstone, the dominant pine species above 8,000 feet is something called a whitebark pine. It's a big, gnarly, high crown tree, very rugged looking, doesn't grow up straight, it grows crooked. It has a wonderfully nutritious nut. The squirrels go up in the fall, bring the nuts down and hide them on the ground. The grizzlies come along and take them. It's a major source of food for grizzly sows right now. And we know from research that if you have a good whitebark pine here, you will have a lot of cubs in the spring. Grizzly sows are self-regulating. If their body fat is not at a certain level, the fertilized zygote in the body disappears. And they do not give birth. They regulate themselves while they're hibernating. Amazing situation. So if you have a good nut year, you have a growing number of bears. We now believe, and we just learned this over the last 5 years, that 85% of the whitebark pine in our region are dead. And the other 15% will almost certainly die in the next 5 years. So that food source is gone. It's happening because of climate change, because it takes 10 days of 10 below zero weather to kill the beetles in the winter. We no longer have those extremes of cold. And so the beetles are expanding their range, and the trees are dying. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with the grizz when that food source is gone. We know they're going to be very creative. They'll find other sources. We hope it's not people's garbage. But again, this illustrates the kinds of conflicts and the kinds of challenges that we are facing. Yellowstone is one of only 12 large landscapes that are intact across the face of the earth. One of the things that we're going to be trying to do is to launch a major initiative aimed at the federal government, aimed at the Obama administration, to say that Yellowstone is so unique as a region, not the park, but the whole region, that is so unique and so special and so world class that we need to have a federal system of managing that land consistently across the national parks, the national forests, the Bureau of Land Management, and all the other federal agencies, so that in a time of climate change and in a time of human development, these lands are managed as a unit. That's not going to be easy. It is going to be, I think, very challenging. But it's the kind of campaign that we think has to be run because what we've learned because of climate change and all these other issues is that you have to take at least a 50-year perspective on managing this region. If you manage it in the terms of a president or a senator, it will deteriorate. And so we are increasingly looking for ways to say, if we think about this region, let's think about it in terms of 50 years or 100 years. I am still optimistic that we can do that. And I say that because everywhere I go in this country, I come across folks like yourselves, whom I'll bet you that if I were to ask each of you in turn, those of you who have been to Yellowstone will tell me a story about how it changed your life in a permanent way. Almost everybody I know who's been there has a love story about Yellowstone. And it's what drives my organization, and it's what drives thousands of people that we're working with to make sure that 50 years from now, when your grandkids go back there, your great-grandkids, they will take their kids and they will see the same landscape and the same animals and the same ecosystem as we see today. I think that's possible. It will not be easy and it will not always be fun, but it's possible. But it will only happen if the American people very clearly say to our government, this is a special place and we want to keep it like it is. let me stop there, and I really don't like to talk. I like to answer questions. And I like to hear people argue if they don't agree with what I'm doing. So I'd like to stop. I hope you're being able to hear me through this thing. I'd like to stop and see what kinds of questions you want to ask. And if you want to, let me go back to the grizzly map, because it's probably the best map. Aren't these wonderful images? These are all ones that have been given to us by the photographers who take them. And they allow us to use them. Little buggers here. I like that one. I have this one blown out 3 by 4 feet on my wall of my office. Okay, this shows the Greater Yellowstone region with the bear recovery zone. It's probably the best map I've got tonight. Let me just leave that up there. And if you have questions, I'll be glad to take them now. Thank you.
Because you and your organization deals with both the Park Service and the Forest Service, is there a basic difference in the way they approach wildlife management?
Yes, there is. And it's not that one is bad and one is good, it's just they're very different. For the park, its regulations and its laws say that you cannot harm the animals and that the natural process that's part of nature has to work itself out. And so since 1968, when they passed a huge series of laws regulating parks, the rangers have left the animals alone to do as they wish. You can't hunt in Yellowstone Park, and that's a big difference. In the National Forest, the forests are managed for what's called multiple use. That includes mining, logging, hunting, fishing, road building, and so the impacts on the habitat and on the species are very different. I think in a time of climate change, we can change that, and we can allow some of these activities to go on in the National Forest, but I think we have to fundamentally rethink what we're doing. Let me give you one, and I'm going to wonder here, but let me give you one quick example. The death of the Whitebark Pine is occurring across our region. 70% of the Whitebark Pine grow in the national parks or in wilderness areas, the two most protected lands in our society. Protected meaning the marketplace is not allowed to strip the resources away from it. Okay? And yet these trees are dying. So we're going to have to fundamentally rethink how we think about protected land. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. You had a question here?
Yes. You said it was the hunters that wanted to, what did you say,
Delist.
Delist, okay. Delist the wolves, but who wants to delist the grizzlies?
Good question. She says the hunters want to delist the wolf, but who wants to delist the grizz? It's a really good question. For the last 25 years, there has been a team of scientists working to bring the bear back from being threatened, and they believe they have succeeded. And so the pressure to delist the grizz right now is coming primarily from scientists and public land managers who think it will be easier to manage the land and the grizzlies if some of these protections are removed. The hunting community is sort of mixed on this. There's not a consensus in the hunting community, so that's not a factor yet. But it's a somewhat perplexing situation. And we'll just have to see how it plays out.
So what is the point of delisting?
The
In
point-
scientific estimation?
Well, there is a team of scientists who have been trying to manage these animals for 25 years. They think they've succeeded. They're about to retire. They would like to get that victory completed in their lifetimes. I'm being very blunt here. And I think that the dynamic is largely driven by personalities. It's also easier for public land managers to manage grizzlies if they are delisted because there are fewer restrictions on how you can manage the land, because grizzlies roam over such a huge area. Yeah.
Isn't there a resource issue, so if you're spending your money protecting grizzly and a stable population, and you're not spending money on other populations?
Yes, there is, and the people fighting over wolves make that point very clearly. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is charged with managing wolves, for example. A third of their budget that's set aside for endangered species goes to manage one species, and that's wolves. And they've got hundreds of other species they're concerned about. Same is true with grizzlies. It's expensive to manage grizzlies. And so the pressure that's building is to say, in a time of climate change, in a time in which we're losing species, is it not more equitable to spend the money on other species and let the states see if they can take care of the grizz? There are lots of different dynamics going on here, and I'm not trying to simplify it. But the budget battles are important. And the Fish and Wildlife Service says very clearly to us, we can't afford to manage wolves anymore. We've got other things we've got to do, and we're going to move on. And there are trade-offs in our society for those kinds of situations. Thank you for that question. Yes?
In the exit, the annual exit up the north and the western route south by the bison, what and who and what's the reason that people will not allow a pathway to move out through the national forests?
The question is, when the bison move out to the west and to the north, why are they being stopped? When they move out down the big river valleys, they ultimately come to private lands where there are cattle and sheep, and the ranchers are afraid that the bison will transmit brucellosis to the cattle, which would undercut the cattle herds.
But the question was, who is stopping the natural forests from having a safe way passage for them to go in?
Well,
Because you had mentioned that there was some discussion about allowing them to go through the national forests. What is that discussion?
The states manage wildlife. When animals come out of the national park, on the national forest lands, the states have jurisdiction over wildlife. And the cattle industry is powerful enough that it has the ability to have state legislatures intervene and set up regulations for killing bison.
In the national forest?
In the national forest.
And I had another question.
Yes.
In the early 70s, I read an incredible book, The Night of the Grizzlies.
Yes.
And it was about Glacier. And it was the first killing in Glacier of grizzlies. Grizzlies killing humans. What is the first instance recorded historically in Yellowstone of grizzlies killing humans there?
She's asking what's the first date. I think it was around the 1910 or so where you had a first fatality of humans, and I'm not sure of that. There have not been very many, and for 26 years we had none. The last death in Yellowstone was in the late 70s, I believe. And until 2 years ago, when we lost several people very quickly, each one for a very different reason. One very tragic situation, these teams of scientists studying bears will often catch bears and they'll drug them, radio collar them, and turn them loose and study them. And near Cody, a large male had been captured and drugged and a radio collar put on it. The team had another grizzly down the road they wanted to look at. They left that grizzly, and a hiker who knew they were in the area was curious about what was going on. He came into the area looking for the team and walked on to the drugged bear just as it was waking up, and it instantly killed him. In another situation, a camper in a campground was attacked by a starving bear and killed, and so we had a sudden flurry of deaths. There has not been, because of that, a major reaction in a local population against grizzlies. But it's a disturbing situation and it's still evolving. We had another person die this summer that was killed by a grizzly sow when he and his wife came upon them. They saw the sow and the cubs and did not retreat and kept going. Walked past the grizzly, decided to turn around and come back, and when they did, the grizzly had moved over into the path. They saw the bear and panicked and ran. They did not have bear spray. They ran and also were screaming for help. And that kicked in a reaction from the bear, and she chased down the man and killed him. And, you know, they did everything wrong. One of the things we're trying to do now is to do a lot more education of people coming into the park about what's the proper, safe ways to live in grizzly country.
Bells don't work anymore?
Bells don't work. Bells don't really work. That's not a good idea. The best way to deal with grizzly country if you're hiking is to hike in groups of 4 or more. There's virtually never been an incident where you have that many people because you make racket. People think bells make a racket. They don't work. Talking works, singing works, being in groups works. But it's, if you live in grizzly country, there are risks you take, and those of us who do try to acknowledge that and to live within the limits of being in grizzly country. But there are always going to be risks. When you've got predators like this, bad things can happen. Yeah?
Just curious, maybe I misunderstood what you said, but you said that as climate change continues, that the bears will come out of the mountains and come down more, and more interaction. It just seems the opposite of, you know, I obviously don't understand it, is the warmer it gets, it seems like they would go higher. No? I mean, it's because of the whitebark pine.
Well, I was talking in terms of a food source. If the whitebark pine dies, that takes away a major food source. If the cutthroat trout die, that takes away a major food source. And so the bears will naturally begin to move up and down. And if they move down, they're going to come into more and more contact with the human population. This map shows that now because if you look at that goal line, they're moving further away from the mountains out into the lower elevations where people live. And so we've had a whole flurry of bear conflicts in the last 3 weeks by hunters of various kinds sneaking through the woods looking for elk or deer and surprising bears. We've had, I think, 5 different attacks in the last month. That's pretty normal for the fall. The major reasons that bears die now is because elk hunters or black bear hunters surprise them in a place where they're sleeping or eating, and they're surprised and they attack. That's the major reason grizzlies die now in Yellowstone, is hunters shooting them because they walk in on them and surprise them. Yeah?
Could you talk about the coal-based methane gas extraction and what effect the fracking has, or the construction of the wells? I know it's in the outer areas now, but it seems as I drive through those areas, it seems it's encroaching more and more into the park areas.
She's asking about the oil and gas techniques and fracking and all. We live along what's called the eastern front. So in this area along in here, on the eastern edge of the mountains, you find oil and gas, and a little further east you find coal. And that's because this is the edge of the great inland lake that once covered most of central North America. And beneath that area there is oil and gas. We're experiencing major explorations up in here where I live. In this area down in here in the Green River Valley, major oil fields. There are now, 20 years ago, there was very little activity in the Pinedale area down in here. There are now 5,000 oil wells or gas wells in this area here that have been put in the last 15 years. Major explorations all along through here. Fracking is not a big issue yet, but it will be, and that's where they inject chemicals under deep pressure, under high pressure deep into the earth, to push the carbohydrates up, and so they can get them. Or not carbohydrates, carbon. And it has major impacts on the groundwater, just like it does here in the east. So there are now major battles shaping up. Most of those don't take place in Greater Yellowstone because we're on the edge. But right here is a major energy conflict, and right in here just south of the Jackson, major conflicts, and up here in the Bridger Mountains near where I live in Bozeman. You're going to hear more and more about this because there are trade-offs. trade-offs in terms of water, but also in terms of air. We live in a Class 1 airshed, some of the cleanest air in the country, yet it's beginning to be clouded by the emissions from energy operations, whether it's coal-fed power plants or the emissions here. These emissions from these wells are so thick because of the wells and the service vehicles that it's beginning to affect the high lakes in the Wind River Range, which is 10,000 feet up, and dominant wind patterns from the west to the east. And those lakes are now being acidified and will ultimately be destroyed if it keeps on going the way it is because of these oil and gas wells. So major conflicts, and it's going to get worse. As we move toward energy independence in this country, the pressure on our region and many other places in the West is going to increase, and there are trade-offs. Yeah.
So you said that the national parks, there's no encroachment of industry in national parks, but could they in fact take the national forest, because that's multi-purpose use, and start putting up wells inside the national forest?
Yes.
Who makes that decision whether or not that's what I really want to know. Who makes the decision whether or not the wells can go into the national forest?
Any national forest that is not wilderness is open to gas and oil exploration unless it's been set aside for study. So most of the national forest lands in Greater Yellowstone, the light green, are open for gas and oil, and especially the BLM lands down in here, federal land. There are two groups of two people who make those decisions, Secretary of Agriculture and Secretary of Interior. And most of that is done by the Secretary of Interior. Ken Salazar, who's pretty positive about energy development. She says, one more question. How about all the way up in the back?
As both the wolf and bear population increase, is there going to be a greater chance of competition between those two species? And if so, is that going to have a bigger impact? Because they can sometimes share the same food source. So is that going to be an issue?
No, I think it's an issue, but they actually have often a symbiotic relationship. It is not unusual now for either wolves or bears to follow the other one looking for food. Wolves will often take down an elk, and a big grizzly will show up and try to take the elk away from them. And the grizzly usually wins. The wolves back off and let it have it still, and they come back in. There's an amazing scenario that takes place when you have a wolf pack, and we're learning this because it was a clean slate before. There were no wolves there. All these scientists are now studying interactions of that, and there's a wonderful book that's just come out by scientist Christina Eisenberg. It's called The Wolf's Tooth, and it's a study of this question. What's the relationship of grizzlies and wolves to each other, to the birds, to the other animals? It's a fantastic book, and I would recommend it to you highly. What we're finding is that the wolves and bears interact with each other in ways that no one predicted. And then the ravens come and they get some of the food, and the coyotes come and they get some of the food. There's now a lot of animals in the sort of middle range that eat meat that actually follow the wolf packs because they know that at some point there's going to be some fresh food. And the other thing that's happening, for example, in parts of our region with wolves, is the wolves drive the elk away. The elk have been overpopulating the area and have been cutting down on the aspen and the willows. And so they're coming back now. And when they come back, you get songbirds, you get beavers coming back. They're studying the interactions now, and they're discovering that the role of the wolf, for example, in our region is far more complex than we realize. And that if you have all the top predators in the system, it makes for a much healthier and more diverse system. And this is a wonderful book if you want to learn more. It's written for people like us by a very good scientist, so it's in English. You can actually understand it. And there's more and more literature coming out about that, and it's really quite wonderful. But we are learning more. I think probably in the last 15 years, we've learned more about how a big ecosystem like this functions than the last 100 years, because so many scientists are now watching what's happening and studying it at a different level. And it's really exciting.
Thank you so much for